So Lisa and I are friends, actually. We've been friends for a very long time. Before she became a nationally known person, we were a couple of theater kids together in New York City. So we've known each other for about 15 years, and it's been really amazing for me to watch her grow in her work. I want to read her bio so you have a little base for who she is, and then I'm going to invite her to come up here and share. So, Lisa Sharon Harper is the founder and president of Freedom Road, a groundbreaking consulting group that crafts experiences that bring common understanding and common commitments that lead to common action toward a more just world. Lisa is a public theologian whose writing, speaking, activism, and training has sparked and fed the fires of reformation in the church from Ferguson and Charlottesville to South Africa, Brazil, Australia, and Ireland. Lisa's book, The Very Good Gospel, was named 2016 Book of the Year, and the Huffington Post identified Lisa as one of the 50 women religious leaders to celebrate on International Women's Day. So let's welcome Lisa with a round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. Let's see what this here. All right, I think we got it. So, before we begin, I made a commitment a while ago when I was in Australia to always start acknowledging the first peoples of the land wherever I go. And the reason for that is because they're not acknowledged. And part of what it looks like to reconcile, to become reconciled, to heal the relationship that's broken is to acknowledge the presence of. So I want to acknowledge the stewardship of this land for thousands of years before it was ever discovered by the Kumeyaay people here in San Diego County area. And we recognize that they served the land, they protected the land, they cultivated the land. And we thank them for giving us permission to do business on their land today. And we bless their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we're talking today about the gospel and the politics of race, all things that you don't talk about in politics or in polite conversation. And so we're going to go there. And the reason why we're going to go there is because I think what I sense from this campus is that you guys are leaning in, that you actually, well, you're here. You guys actually chose to be here. You didn't have to. And I want to say thank you for that. When we talk about politics, let's start there. We talk about politics, we have to kind of define our terms. Politics is simply the conversations that we have and the decisions that we make about how the polis will live together. That's all. It's just that. Now, our first president, George Washington, actually said at one point that if our politics ever gets to be so hyper partisan, we will not be able to govern anymore because our government was not set up to handle that. And we are there. We are right there, right now. That's all politics is supposed to be, is the question of how we will live together in common space on this land. Now, what is race? Race is simply, it's a political construct. It's literally something that was constructed in order to answer the question of how we will live together on land. Now, you guys hear me? All right, cool. So I know that there might be some question marks, but that's what this whole presentation is for. It's to begin to address those question marks. Wait a minute, I heard race was this, or we've been talking about race since I was in kindergarten. I thought that this was from God. Well, I'm here to break your bubble, to burst your bubble. It's not. I mean, it literally is when I say political, what do I mean? I mean, race answered the question of how we would live together. It's not real. It was devised to do one thing, to answer one major question. And that question is, who was created by God with the capacity and the divine call to exercise dominion on land? That is what race does. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to take a little trip. We're going to take a little trip through history. And so I want us to start with Plato, but before I go there, let me just say I'm going to give you a little outline of our talk today, of our teaching. We're going to do history, then we're going to ask the question of what's the implications of this history and the intersections of this history with what we know to be true in the scripture. Then we're going to ask the question of what does this history, how does this impact how we think about the world? And then how we think about the world impact how we form policy? Okay, you got it? That's where we're going. All right, cool. So Plato's Republic, 360 BC, he says in his Republic, which is a pontification on how the polis should live together, how the Republic works, he said there's this thing called race. And this thing called race works like this. Some people are made of gold, other people are made of silver, other people are made of copper and iron, and however people are made, the metal they're made with determines how they will serve society, how they will serve the Republic. So you can see from Plato's Republic, that in the very beginning, the conception of race was conceived to order society. Now, it wasn't necessarily hierarchical at that time. That's arguable. There's good arguments on both sides. But let me tell you, it did not take long. So it took about 10 years. And one of Plato's students, Aristotle, he actually began that first bifurcation that was very clear. In his letter called On Interpretation, where he was talking about languages, he talks about Western supremacy. When he talks about Western supremacy, Kelly Brown Douglas, who wrote Stand Your Ground, she is the person who really kind of goes into this. And then Jar Joseph Lebors from Emory University, he actually explains that when Aristotle talked about Western supremacy, when he talked about whiteness, or humanity rather, what he would have said, what he would have been thinking in his head, that in order to be fully human, one has to be three things: white, male, and able-bodied. So in order to be considered fully human, according to Aristotle, and also just in the general sphere of thought at his time, those three things had to be present. Well, it didn't take long until we got Papal Bull Romanus Pontifex in 1455. You fast forward 3 years earlier, Pope Nicholas V paved the way for the Portuguese slave trade in West Africa when Alfonso V came to him and said, "Yo, Pope, I need a blessing. I'm going to go exploring." And the Pope said, "Hey, I'll give you a blessing, and I'll do you one better. You will have the right to actually claim the land of uncivilized and unchristian people, right? And enslave them if they are not civilized." So what is that about? Why would they do that? Well, that's a bad read of this text of Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Because Genesis 1, 26 and 27 tells us very clearly, then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So here on the first page of the Bible, in the first chapter of the first book, it is clear that to be human is to be made in the image of God. And to be made in the image of God is to be called and created with the capacity to exercise dominion in the world. So what we have here is an abrogation of the truth replaced with a lie. Now it's a spiritual lie. It went from bad philosophy to bad religion. And it didn't take long to go from that to bad science. And then we get Carl Linnaeus. We just flash forward a few hundred years. Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist, and he's the guy who discovered kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Remember that? 7th grade science? Remember that? Yeah, good. So he discovered that, and then like a few years after he discovered that, he actually said, "You know what? Since this works with fauna, certainly it works with humanity. Let's try it. So this is what he did. He put himself on top, and he called it White Europeanus. Really scientific, right? Right, exactly. And then under that, what do you think he put under that? What's under that? Oh no, I wish we were that high up. No. Nope. It was Red Americanus was next. Under Red Americanus was Yellow Asiatus. And under Yellow Asiatus on the bottom was Black Africanus. Good guess. So that now is bad science, which came from bad religion, which came from bad philosophy. And now, 41 years later, you get this. You get the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise, you now have bad philosophy, religion, and science codified into law. Now, law is supposed to be the secular Bible. It's supposed to tell us what is just, what is right, what is good. It orders our society. And hopefully a society wants to be ordered according to what is just, right, and good. Am I right? Do you want to be ordered according to what is wrong, unjust, and not good, bad? No. So that's what the law is supposed to do. And yet our law in the very first American Congress instituted this compromise. Now, this compromise was actually a compromise between the North and the South. The northern states did not want to count people of African descent as human at all. But it was a compromise with the South. Because here's the thing, in the North, they just had many more white people. In the South, they had a whole lot more land and a whole lot more people of African descent. And they weren't going to let them vote. And so in order to even out the playing field, the first gerrymandering, actually, they jerry-rigged the districts by counting the people of African descent as 3/5 of a person and then, ironically, not giving them a vote. This first Congress of the United States of America, which became the United States of America because it fought the Revolutionary War, because they were sick of being taxed without representation, just instituted non-representation for people who are actually counted in Congress. And so that's the Three-Fifths Compromise. And then 3 years later, they did the first census. And on the first census, you'll see there's only one. I'm trying to see if I can do a little pointer. I can. So right here, you can actually see, and I'll do it over here too, if I can. It's not doing it. Okay, so I'll keep it over here. So over here, you'll see this is the only race that's actually, all of these are all, only one race is represented, and that's white. On the very first census, only one race is represented. Hear that, my people. And it's the only race that has never changed in all the years since 1790. It's the only race that has never changed, never been disaggregated. You'll never find Irish American in the racial category. You'll never find Swedish American, but you will find African American and Caribbean and disaggregated. But why would they do that? Why would they do that? It's an aggregation of power. That's why. And in the same year, they actually then passed the Naturalization Act. Oh, okay, here we go. Oh, there we go. So no. Oh, now we're going to play. Here we go. So Naturalization Act of 1790, which said, it made it explicit. In case people didn't get it, here it is explicit. If you are white, male, and of good character and free, then you can become a naturalized citizen. Well, why would they do that? Why would they actually care about naturalization? Why does that matter? Well, it matters because naturalization is it gives the ability to vote. And voting is the most fundamental way to exercise dominion in a democracy. And so there was a hoarding of power a hoarding of agency, a blocking off of agency of anyone who did not fall within that realm. And let me tell you, in this moment, we can actually see who won the argument. There was an argument about who would be able to exercise power on this land. In the 1760s, Ben Franklin argued that that this land should be set aside to preserve the white race. Yes, Ben Franklin did. The guy with the kite and the key. That was him. He made that argument to the crown in the 1760s. And so they were arguing that he didn't want Germans to be considered white, by the way. He didn't want Irish to be considered white. He argued to the crown that only the English should be called white because, after all, we are the ones who discovered this land, he said. And so here in 1790, he basically wins. He wins the argument. Now, they end up enlarging the white franchise over the next century as new immigrants come in, and they have to their white status has to be determined. And they argue all the way up to the Supreme Court, arguing whether or not they were white. And it was the Supreme Court who determined that Armenians are white. It was the Supreme Court who determined that Germans were white. This had to be argued legally. So whiteness is not it's not about skin color. It is about politics. It is about how the polis will live together. And ultimately, it is about power, the ability to exercise dominion on land. So there's a core spiritual lie. Oh, what did I do? Okay, there's a core spiritual lie at work here. The core spiritual lie is that white men are created by God to exercise with unique capacity and divine call to exercise dominion on this land. That was the core spiritual lie at work under all of these policies. And everyone else was created to be ruled. Now, what's the core spiritual truth? The core spiritual truth is that all humanity, we know this from Scripture, was created to exercise dominion. We're all made in the image of God. And we're all created to steward the world. Now, the thing is, we have to face the reality that our world was crafted by a lie. It was structured by a lie. We know the truth now, but that truth is not what shaped our world. The lie shaped our world. And so Dr. Andrea Smith, she's actually in Riverside. She wrote a really great article called 3 Pillars of White Supremacy that I want to share with us now, and then we'll kind of go into how it has worked out. The 3 Pillars of White Supremacy, I found it to be one of the most helpful things that everybody needs to know, period. It's the logics of white supremacy as they are applied to different people groups. And this helps us to understand how these things get worked out through our policies and through our common life together. What she's discerned, and what she's talking, it's a theory, and so we can talk about it and you can add to it, and she really does not want to be kind of the final word at all, but I found it very helpful. What she says is that white supremacy's logic as applied to Native American people is the logic of erasure. It's the logic of genocide. It's the logic that says these people are utter savages, and so they must be eradicated. They must be erased. But actually, underneath that, the goal is to erase them from the land so that the land can be acquired and used to uphold white male flourishing. Do you get it? That's the logic. The logic, and that you can see here, and this is Colombia. Colombia was an image that was used to get people to come to the West, where we are right now. Settlers followed Colombia across the country. You might have even seen this in history class and been taught the history of our nation with this image at its forefront. You can see behind Columbia are the cities, the teeming cities of like New York City in the very background. And you see the steam engine, and you see the Native Americans, savages, running away along with the buffalo because Columbia is coming. It's manifest destiny. It's the lie of the city on the hill. It's the lie of the untamed wilderness. And from Columbia, we get the Cherokee Trail of Tears. And from Columbia, we get the Sand Creek Massacre. And from Columbia, and from that lie of the doctrine of discovery, we get slavery. Now, the logic of white supremacy as applied to people of African descent is different than Native Americans. The logic of white supremacy as applied to people of African descent says people of African descent exist to provide low cost or no cost labor for white flourishing. That's the logic. And so we were literally acquired from the land of Africa, brought across almost like crate-like status, and then bought and sold regardless of our families. Family separation was common in these days. And now from here, you get the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was, here we go. 13th Amendment, we get that, of course, after the Civil War, and the 13th Amendment is like a thumb in the dam, and it stops the tide, and it says, no longer are we going to do slavery. No longer are we going to have slaves in our nation, except in the case of prison. And that was, again, a compromise to get the South to play well with the North. And so trying to figure out how they were going to deal, how they were going to flourish, how farm landowners were going to replace the free, low-cost and no-cost labor that they had had for 246 years. They created the system of peonage. And peonage and convict leasing peopled the same farms and work sites that had been peopled and worked on by enslaved men and women. And these were still slaves, but now they were slaves to the state. They were literally picked up off the state. They would pass a law that said, vagrancy law. If you sit on a park bench for more than 20 minutes, you are now a vagrant and you have to be taken to jail. And jail was the same plantation you were just freed from. And so they would literally pick up 10-year-old boys, 14-year-old boys who sat on a park bench for too long. And they would take that 10, 14-year-old boy to the work camp. And the average lifespan within the work camps was 1 year. The policy was to work them to death. It was worse than slavery because they had a steady, free stream of that free labor because they could pick them up off the street for looking at a white woman in the eyes and put them in that work camp. Millions of black men disappeared. This is a work camp in Sugarland, Texas. And there was also the sharecropping system, which again propagated the low-cost labor and actually even made a profit. And when we began to flee the South in order to find our own freedom and also escape the terror of lynching, which was going on at the same time, then those farms became emptied again. And who peopled them? The Chinese. The Chinese were brought in to the same slave cabins that we once filled and to the same fields in order to people and to do labor on the same fields. Why? Because white flourishing matters the most. And they had no protections. And so So they did that. So that now the Burlingame Treaty before the Civil War was actually a compact between China and America, and it was a friendly treaty. And that's actually what brought the Chinese here to do the railroads. They didn't allow their families to come or their wives to come. They didn't have women at all, and because they didn't want them to multiply and populate and fill the land. But after the Civil War, when white power was threatened, when white hegemony was threatened, that's when this happened. And the Chinese Exclusion Act. And when Chinese people began to move on, when they began over time, when they began to move on from those fields and moving on from the railroads and began to set up their own communities where they set up their own economies, and the fields still needed to be plowed, well, who was next? Mexicans in the same fields, and they're still there today. The Bracero program was started right around the time of the World War II, and it was a deal between the Mexican government and the American government. And so therefore, any of the farmers who brought in braceros to come and help do the field work, the braceros could not bargain for their own labor protections. So they slept in boxcars, train boxcars. They had no water in the field. They had no ability to go to the bathroom in the field. They had their families were not allowed to come with them. So family separation started then. And it's very similar actually to the H2A and H2B, H1A, H1B programs that we have today that are very, very similar because it doesn't change. And then, of course, you have the Japanese internment camps, which Andrea Smith talks about the logic of white supremacy as it is applied to people of Asian descent and Middle Eastern. She says that the logic says this, that people of Asian descent and Middle Eastern are almost human. They're pretty close, but they're not fully human. So they are a constant threat. They are the perpetual enemy. And so they must be contained. They must be dominated. They must be subjugated through war. So there's constant sense of war against people of Asian descent or containment. And the Japanese internment camp is a great example of this because, I mean, come on, it was Japanese internment, but the Germans never got interned. Come on, think about that for a minute. The Germans were never interned on this land during the World War II. So next we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, another thumb in the dam happens. And you have now the enforcement of the 13th Amendment and 14th Amendment. The right of citizenship by birth, which is the 14th Amendment, and the stopping of slavery, which is the 13th Amendment. And so the Civil Rights Act guarantees that people have the right to be protected by the law, and segregation was outlawed. So they just found another way to do it. And we now look at this and we understand it's mass incarceration. But at the time, the strategy was exactly the same. The strategy was to lower the bar of criminality, just like they did in the time of peonage and convict leasing. But instead of vagrancy, they focused it on drugs because, well, everybody knows drugs are bad, right? But did you know that before that moment, before Nixon declared war on drugs in early 1970s, before that moment, the people group who used opium the most in our country were white women. And it was not considered illegal. It had never been thought of as illegal. It wasn't thought of as illegal until it was racialized. And then we consider the Muslim ban. The Muslim ban falls directly into Andrea Smith's thinking of the logic against Middle Easterners. That this ban, though it was never fully passed, it did hold people in place while they were waiting for the law to be overturned or waiting for a judgment to be ruled. And this ban, it broke up families. It actually threatened the livelihoods of people. And the whole point was to stave off that constant enemy. And what is happening in our nation, even right now? Pulling out of Syria and leaving the Kurds absolutely vulnerable. Hundreds of thousands streaming across the border today in Iraq. And we don't care. Why? Because they are the constant threat. They can deal with their own stuff. Maybe they'll all kill each other and we'll all be the better, right? And Tornillo. Tornillo was a concentration camp, an internment camp that was set up just a year and a half ago in our southern desert. And it literally looked exactly like Dachau. I went to Dachau. I saw pictures of Dachau. When I saw this, I literally froze, shuddered, and shook because I realized this is like Dachau. Now, Dachau was not started as a death camp. It was started as a work camp, and it looked just like this. Over time, give it time, and the worst demons in our nature can turn anything into death. But what is this? This is the need to contain. Now, what Andrea Smith says of the logic of white supremacy as applies to Latinos is that because Latinos are mestizaje, they are many different things, white, native, and African descent. Well, then it can be applied in multiple ways. It's like fluid. And we see that the best examples are at the border right now. You have both the wall that is trying to keep the enemy out and the exploitation of low-cost labor in the fields. And let's not forget our Native American brothers and sisters at Standing Rock, where right now, today, or last year or 2 years ago, and today actually, they're still fighting. The government fought to acquire the land in order to make a pipeline go through the land, through a sacred burial ground of the Native people on that land. And that is the story of Native people. And it's the way that the logic is applied and works its way out through policy. So now I want to ask, what is the psychological impact of this? What's the impact? What does a society grow to believe about the other after 500 years of soaking in these logics? You get it? You get it? You get it? You're getting it. Are you getting it? Good. So we're going to talk about implicit and explicit bias. Okay, good. So explicit bias and implicit bias. Explicit bias, just think of that as conscious bias. Who here are familiar with these terms? Raise your hand. So almost everybody. That's actually really, really good. Then I'll go fast through this. Explicit bias is conscious, implicit bias, unconscious. When we think of implicit bias, unconscious bias, everybody does it. Everybody has it. Everybody. And so implicit bias at its core is really just unconscious associations that we make in order to lessen our thought processes about a thing. So that instead of looking at this and saying, this has a platform, a leg, and a stand at the bottom, therefore it is a table, we look at it and go, table, right? So implicit bias in terms of psychology and race, the way we've racialized it, is we look at a person of African descent, and because of 400 years of seeing them in shackles with overseers and whips, and also offering low-cost labor in fields and behind bars, now we understand Black person, criminal. You see? I think the best example of this is when Michael Brown was shot dead by Darren Wilson in Ferguson. What did he say about him? Do you remember? He said he looked like a demon. He said he looked like a monster coming at him. There was that level of fear was going on in Darren Wilson. And actually, he was dying. He was falling down dead. So let's take a look at implicit bias. So 75% of all people who have tested for implicit, this is tested using the Harvard Implicit Association test, have tested positive for implicit bias toward whiteness and against blackness. And the outcomes of implicit bias are that structures and systems are shaped by implicit bias. Systems and structures reinforce implicit bias and explicit bias, and implicit bias creates systems and structures that achieve the same purpose of the original lie: to control and confine African bodies on U.S. soil and the protection of the uniquely human status of whiteness. And I would add, and that little line was actually written when this was only about people of African descent, I would add, to confirm all of the different logics of white supremacy. So just quickly, we're going to roll through this. Let's look at how the policies are actually shaped by explicit and implicit bias. This is going to be fast, and then we're going to move into conversation. Voting rights. Explicit bias, Jim Crow voter suppression, 3/5 compromise, racially targeted gerrymandering. That's explicit, right? Implicit bias, the lack of our prioritization of fixing the Voting Rights Act. The fact that it has sat there for 6 years, broken, gutted, and ain't nobody marching. Nobody is getting beaten up on Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge to fix that Voting Rights Act, because we don't value it, because of implicit bias. And also the statement that was made by our current president just after he won, he said, well, blacks just need to get out and vote. In other words, they're lazy. They haven't gotten out to vote. Therefore, they lost. No mention of the fact that there's been a pointed, strategic, and coordinated effort to suppress the black vote since 2013. Criminal justice. Peonage, slave patrols, convict leasing, lynching, these are all policies that were created out of explicit bias. Implicit bias policies might be the drug war, mandatory minimum sentences, no judicial discretion, the stop and frisk policy in New York City. Another one that I add in here is the 3 strikes and you're out policy here. Killing with impunity, the death penalty and how it's applied, for-profit prisons, officer shootings. These are all things that happen because of unconscious bias. Both they are crafted and enforced because of unconscious bias. Let's look at immigration. Immigration, let's go back, hold. Okay, so immigration, Naturalization Act in 1790, Chinese Exclusion Act, Mexicans are rapists at our borders, which was just, 3 years ago, somebody said that, hello, and we need a wall to keep them out. These are all explicit biases that are shaping our public policy and have shaped it. Implicit bias in this realm might look like border security and then policy reform, right? We've heard, how many times have we heard that? Chain migration. We have to stop chain migration. That's drawing on our unconscious biases. We don't want those people to come and take over, right? To leverage our system to get their families over here. And ending the lottery system. Who here is familiar with the lottery system? And I don't mean the lottery that you play to get rich. You're not. Okay, no. Okay, so the lottery system is actually it is the system that helps our nation. It was developed to make us a more diverse nation. Somebody who would never have the funds or the ability or the pull in their own nation to be able to come here can enter an immigration lottery, or they were able to, and they were able to win out of millions of people, win the opportunity to come to the United States to make a better life for themselves. Well, we just ended that. Why would we do that? Who does it benefit is the question. Education, Plessy versus Ferguson, Jim Crow segregated schools, enslaved prohibited from learning to read. That's all explicit. Implicit, parents and community schools versus Seattle School District. That's 2007. A 2007 Supreme Court ruling that said that de facto segregation is just fine. It was a cut on the face of Brown versus the Board of Education. Racialized stigma of public schooling, Title I funds being shifted so that they're not actually going to the schools that deserve them and need them. The tracking of students, and also the racialization of school discipline. And gun violence. Gun violence, armed state slave patrols. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but slave patrols were basically vigilante groups that were formed in order to protect landowners and slaveholders from attempted insurrections in the antebellum South around the early 1800s to mid 1800s. Well, that's why the Second Amendment was passed. It was passed to give those vigilante groups the ability to carry guns. That was the reason for the Second Amendment. That's explicit bias. Implicit bias is whenever we have one of those mass shootings, it's a lone wolf, they're mentally ill. Versus anytime we hear anything that happens in an urban center, in an African American community, they're a thug. Open carry laws. You pass them drawing on people's implicit bias that they are at threat. And then stand your ground laws were actually passed in order to protect women from domestic violence, but they're being used in the courts against women of color primarily, and men. Environmental racism, the Indian removals, the banning of people of color from national parks, these are all explicit bias. But then implicit bias, Dakota Access Pipeline, and the business justification for it. We just need this to flourish, to have our business for capitalism. The dismantling of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the lifting of protections from toxins being dumped into poor brown neighborhoods, and the taking governing power away from communities of color like Flint. And then finally, poverty. Redlining, ghettoization, transportation disparity, employment discrimination. These are all explicit biases. And the implicit, the policies that are born of and reinforce implicit bias might look like food deserts, environmental injustice, disparate health care, building wealth. By this, what I mean is when we get into conversations about poverty, oftentimes in these kinds of circles, what we'll find people saying, oh, but that's not, food stamps don't build wealth. But that's not the conversation. We're not asking the question of how we build wealth. We're asking the conversation of how we keep people from falling below the poverty line. Those are two different and both worthy conversations. But can we please separate them so we can have an honest conversation about both? And then the glass ceiling and pay disparity. So friends, how do we confront and dismantle the lie? We do it by living and reforming our world according to the truth. Amen. Thank you.